remember that the best way to study is to take practice tests. And if you don't have good practice tests, build your own and learn while you do it using the Learn My Test study tool. It's absolutely free at learnmytest.com. And you can actually check out in our description a link to take a practice test that I made using the Learn My Test study tool. Like I said, check it out. It's absolutely free. And so today we're just going to talk briefly about the different types of research studies in psychology. And I do have a text citation, so Ciccarelli and White, Psychology and Exploration, 4th edition. I did use some of the materials from that textbook to come up with this presentation, so I wanted to give them credit for it. So some ways to test your hypothesis. So the first is a survey research. So you can send out a survey. It asks a list of questions. You can send it out online, and people respond to it. So you've probably gotten it from a company that you may have bought something from, or you may have had some service from a company, and they may say on a scale of 1 meaning terrible to 10 meaning amazing, how well did you rate our the customer service that you received or whatever. So it's a great technique to obtain attitudes, behaviors by a group, and to obtain information from a large group of people over a short period of time. The only issue with one of the big issues with surveys are that it's very difficult to determine cause and effect with them. A lot of times you're just looking at relationships between different things. You're not really looking at like I said, isolating things, determining cause and effect. But like I said, it's a very effective way to get the opinions, attitudes, or behaviors over a large group of people with relatively minimal effort. So a case study is a very in-depth investigation or report of one specific case or one group type of thing. And I'll go over a case in a minute. And a case study in a minute, a really famous one in psychology, and Phineas Gage. And then there's naturalistic observations, which are basically observing people in their natural setting. So, just studying people and how they were, how they live life without taking them out. So if you think of, like, for example, like a survey or a case study, you have to go to somebody and say, hey, will you be in my study? But a naturalistic observation, you don't do that. You just observe like their natural, what they would do in their natural setting. And I'll talk about that in a minute. An advantage of the naturalistic observation, like I said, is that you're getting people in their natural habitat. You're not removing them from their situation. And so that's a weakness of a laboratory study, is that you're telling somebody to go out of their natural setting of what they would do normally and go in this lab and do this thing. And so just because they act one way in the lab doesn't mean they're going to act that way in their real life. And so that's a big downside of a laboratory study. But an advantage of the laboratory study is that you can, if you're in a lab, you can control a lot of the settings and a lot of the variables and things like that. So it helps determine a cause and effect relationship. It's very difficult. All three of these other options, it's very difficult to determine a cause and effect, because here you're not really controlling anything. You're just observing people. So let me give you some examples of some other studies that you might run into when you're going through your literature review. So intervention studies test the effectiveness of some type of psychological treatment. It can be a medication. It can be a psychological behavioral intervention like psychotherapy or something like that. And then what they'll do is they'll have a test before they do the intervention, and then a test after, and they'll see if their symptoms improve over time. Something to look out for with intervention studies is attrition. So attrition, attrition, is people dropping out. So if you do an intervention and like 50% of the people drop out of the study, then the intervention might work, but it only worked for 50% of the people because 50% dropped out. So that's just something to look for. And a meta-analysis is taking a bunch of studies and putting them all together, and because a lot of studies can say different things. And so when you put all of the same studies together into one big, massive study, you get a meta-analysis. And meta-analysis are very, very important for the field of research because it helps us gain an understanding about something that maybe wasn't clear before. And so for your research paper, I don't want you to use a meta-analysis, although you can use an intervention study. So your research paper must include studies that have human subjects in them. So if they don't have human subjects, you can't use them. And meta-analysis may have human subjects, but a lot of times they're just using groups of studies that do have human subjects in them. So just some examples of a case study that's really famous in psychology is Phineas Gage. And he was a railroad worker and he had a little accident at work, just a little accident. And this pole got shoved right through his brain right here. And this is the frontal area of the brain. So this is Phineas here. And before the accident, Phineas was this like really pleasant guy. He's a really nice guy, very well mannered, good temperament and just fun to be around, nice person, hard worker, and all that. And then they were surprised that he lived, first of all, but he did live. And they noticed that even though he lived and he was walking around, there were things that were different about him. And one of the things that was different was he had difficulty controlling his emotions. He was very quick to anger and quick to cry. He had difficulty with planning and concentration and attention. And so, what this case of Phineas Gage showed us was that this area of the brain right here, this front area of the brain, the frontal lobe is responsible for attention, planning, staying focused on a task, persisting and completing a task, emotion regulation or emotion control. So this is just an example of how case studies can be really important. And this is one individual, one case. So a naturalistic observation, an example of that would be maybe getting Facebook data from somebody and coding their statuses as positive and negative on whether they identify as Christian or Jewish or another religion. And maybe you could come and say, over this week, we found that Christians had more positive status than other religions. And so that would be a naturalistic observation because you're using people's Facebook statuses that they would already post anyway. And so that you're not asking them, hey, will you be in my study? You're just coding their Facebook statuses that is already readily available information on the internet. So the difference between, like I said, naturalistic observation compared to any other study is that you don't ask them to be in your study. The data is already readily available. So thank you so much for watching this video. And remember, the best way to study is to take practice tests. And if you can't find good practice tests, build your own and learn while you do it using the Learn My Test study tool. It's absolutely free, www.learnmytest.com.